Dear friends, we are in your country as your guests at a very critical time. In fact, probably the most critical period since the Syriza government was elected. And there are two big choices to be made. And to understand these choices, one has to see what the strategy of the European elite, and largely the German government and the German banks, has been over the last years. Let's not forget that Europe did fight, or sections of Europe did fight, to prevent a European constitution from including as one of its central features neoliberalism. They did fight against that. There was a referendum in France against the constitution which was won against this, despite the fact that every single French newspaper, television channel was for. The French voted against, which goes to show that one mustn't overestimate the media. It can be defeated. It has been defeated in South America. It can be defeated in Europe too. But it can only be defeated if there is a regular link between politics and the masses and mass movements, which happens in different ways. Without that, it becomes difficult. But to return to the situation in Europe, the Dutch voted against, ignored. The French people voted against the EU constitution, ignored. The Irish voted against the constitution, bullied, attacked, till they made to vote again, till they voted in the right way. So this is the history, the recent history of the European Union. And one has to understand it to see what can be done and what can't be done. Now, I think, apart from people who are completely sectarian and lived locked up in closed worlds, we cannot say that the ultimate demand, as Samir Amin has been stressing, of communism or communist revolution is possible. Let's be clear about that. Then the question then becomes, what is possible? And here we see the New World Order created after the 1990s, imposing on the world via the Washington Consensus one form of capitalism, i.e. what we call, loosely speaking, neoliberal capitalism. Essentially a return to the capitalism that existed in the early years of the 20th and 19th century in modern conditions. I say modern conditions because the development of capitalism isn't finished. It isn't over. It's not that they are intellectually stagnating, the capitalists. The most striking advance, capitalist advance, but accepted by the whole world, came where? Came from where? From the west coast of the United States. They produced the computers, they produced the web, which is now used by our side as well. And one has to say that they had been making these advances. And it is these technological advances which also were instrumental in the way in which financialized capitalism works, like this. And they boast about it, the transfers of money from one bank to the other. So one has to, as my late comrade and friend Giovanni Arrighi used to say, you cannot understand economics without understanding politics, and vice versa. The two go together. And in order to understand what is going on, we have to see that the neoliberal system and its engineers have created now a political system which was created in North America a long time ago, but which has now come to Europe, effectively of a single party with two faces, in virtually every parliament. It's a system which I have characterized recently as the extreme center. It doesn't matter whether it's the center left or the center right, they basically carry on the same policies. And this is finally, and they capture votes through their old clientelist networks, partially through corruption, and what divides them is not politics or policies on any level, foreign, social, economic. What divides them is that they have their own different gangs of supporters who have to be helped along. This is what explains, by the way, in my opinion, the stronghold, the failure of the left to defeat the PSOE in Andalusia. It's not that their politics were superior, but they have still managed to hang on, especially in the smaller towns and villages and countryside, the old systems whereby they won the electoral support of the people. So it's, the situation is different in different parts of Europe, and it's determined by the histories of these countries. In Spain, we lost the Civil War, which was a huge disaster for Europe. In Greece, there was a big partisan resistance to the fascists in this country, and a civil war waged by the so-called democracies against the Greek people. When the German poet Bertolt Brecht wrote a beautiful poem, of which 2 lines I remember: "Mothers of Athens, lock up your sons tonight. The old man of Downing Street is bringing back your king." And so a constant struggle against real, genuine democracy took place in Europe at that particular period, and it's left us with many legacies. Now, we can't keep on harking back to the 20th century. It can't be repeated, but we can't forget it either, because there are some things that were said and done in the 20th century of which, as socialists, we should remain proud. After all, even before the 20th century, when Marx described the state as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, and in the 1960s and 70s there's a huge debate about the state and its character, and the classical Marxist interpretation was criticized by many as being too instrumentalist a view of the state. And we had a very fascinating debate between a Greek Marxist, Nikos Poulantzas, Ralph Miliband, and many others. A very interesting debate. But when you look at that statement today, the state is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. That is what the state did and the role it played in the 2008 economic crash, the Wall Street crash. In country after country, we were told the state has no role to play, it's the market. Bullshit. Without the state, capitalism could not have been recuperated without the capitalist state. And the money they gave in Greece, of course, we know, but all over Europe and North America, was to the banks. It was the banks that got the money. And in Britain, they had to nationalize 2 failing banks to shore them up again, to build them with taxpayers' money, and now they're going to be sold into the market again. So the state is allowed to play a role to defend capitalism. It's not allowed to play a role to defend the poor. And that is the way capitalism functions today. And this capitalism, whether we like it or not, is still dominated by the United States politically. It's not even a question of the American economy, though that isn't as weak as many people think. But politically, this system is dominated by the United States. And if you look at the world, you see it. Even the strongest country in Europe, Germany, is not a fully sovereign country. And the German bourgeoisie knows it very well. The German political elite knows it very well. It's not a sovereign state. The Japan, the Japanese, they are even worse off than Germany. Effectively a US protectorate. And any Japanese prime minister who tries to and achieve even a tiny bit more sovereignty is removed. When the Defense Secretary Gates went to Japan after they removed a Japanese prime minister who wanted to discuss and negotiate the American base in Okinawa, Gates was so angry that they were even doing it, he refused to attend the official dinner in his honor given by the Japanese prime minister. That is how they behave, and that is how they operate. And they haven't given up any notions of global hegemony. That is what they are fighting for. And people say, but will new contradictions emerge between the United States and other capitalist or neo-capitalist powers? There's no signs of it as yet. Excuse me. And when people say the Americans have been defeated in the Arab world, I say nonsense. The Americans have destroyed the Arab world, one country after the other. Iraq, destroyed. Literally. Its entire social infrastructure dismantled. The University of Baghdad doesn't function effectively anymore, and this was a university which in the late 1980s, just to give you a social statistic, had more women teaching in it at top levels of professorships, assistant professorships, etc., than Princeton University does today. That is a fact. And on the social level, it was one of the more progressive countries. Destroyed. Syria destroyed. Egypt, a new military dictatorship. Libya destroyed. Now controlled by 3 jihadi factions because of NATO's 6-month bombing of that country. And that's why people are fleeing these countries. And when the Europeans say, oh, there are too many immigration, there's too much immigration, too many immigrants coming, what can we do? The answer is, one thing you can do is stop occupying these countries and stop making wars. That's when people decide to leave countries. Apart, of course, for traditional economic reasons. So this is the globe. This is the globe on which we live. China is a huge subject. I have a different opinion than Samir, but we can discuss this some other time. But I would just say be careful, because the Chinese intelligentsia, for what it is, there are of course many good people and critics, but the dominant view within that intelligentsia is neoliberal. The institutes that have been set up in the name of Hayek and Milton Friedman are not joke institutions. These are real. And they believe that this is the form of capitalism that has been moved forward. Of course, China is a sovereign state, and that is of extreme importance, and we cannot deny it. Now, to come back to something which many of us who have been in solidarity with the Greek left for a long, long time, since the years of the dictatorship, know, is that the present situation is extremely important. Why? Why? Because the eyes of the entire continent, and many people even outside this continent, are on Greece. What is going to happen here? If, and I was in Madrid a few weeks ago, and many of the comrades of Podemos, they said, we are anxious because the right-wing press in Spain uses Greece all the time. You want to be like Greece? What is happening in Greece today? Okay, then vote Podemos. So the responsibility of this government is an international one today. First and foremost to the people of Greece. Of course, it goes without saying, but as Tsipras has said many a time, we know that we are fighting not just for Greece, but for other Europeans too. That's true. And therefore, the stage in which they have got to now, the choices are very straightforward. Either total capitulation and surrender, which would be a real tragedy, both for Syriza, for Tsipras, for other comrades, but most importantly, for the Greek people. Now, people say to me all the time, but this contradiction which exists within the government and Syriza is a reflection of the contradiction that exists in Greek society today. And that is true. Because it is not just the Syriza leadership. The problem is that between 60 to 70% of the Greek people say they do not want to leave the Eurozone. Now, when they say that, how do you react? You can't say you're stupid, because this is what they've been taught to believe. This is what was in the Syriza program, that we are both going to carry through our program and stay in the Eurozone. This was a contradiction embedded in the program from the beginning. And when I came here in 2010, 2011, 2012, I said to many comrades from different groups in Greece, this is a contradiction that will implode. Because unless you have an alternative plan which visualizes an existence outside the Eurozone, you will weaken yourselves more and more and more. And that is effectively what has been happening. The last document presented by the government, it's an economic document, but it's very clear. It more or less accepts the basis of the EU negotiators. Even this is rejected by them. Why? And this, I think, is not really, I don't think was properly understood by the leadership of Syriza. That the campaign the Europeans were waging against them, when I say Europeans, I mean the EU elite, just take that for granted, that the campaign that was being waged against them by the political leadership of the European Union was not an economic one. To be totally frank, the money which Greece owes is peanuts. It's nothing given the European budget. If they wish to, they could solve it. No, the challenge is a political challenge. They do not like the idea of any political movement in Europe coming up and challenging neoliberalism. Why? Because if they succeed even partially in one country, it will spread, they fear, to the rest of Europe, because the European economies are in a crisis. So the EU elite is operating on a very sharp political level. Destroy this example. Destroy it is what their plan is, which is why when Syriza goes even further to appease them, they don't accept it. And the Germans, I don't think this is a huge secret. The German leadership, Schäuble in particular represents that, says it would be better for Europe if Greece left. That's their real opinion, because then we can remodel this creature we call the European Union, restructure it, and have effectively a two-tier European Union. It could also solve problems with some of the East Europeans, and probably when the Turks, who are on their knees begging us to come into Europe, but they might be surprised there, we can put them in this two-tier system as well. That is, they have to restructure it, because Greece or no Greece, Spain or no Spain, the whole European Union system is in a crisis. And one of the roots of this crisis is that it is crazy to imagine that you can have one single currency for a region which is so divided in many different ways and so uneven. It's never been done before, and it's very difficult to do it again. Now, so the choice I fear is going to be the choice of the EU elite. They might drive the Syriza out of the, or Greece out of the Eurozone, and that will be that. But if they do that, the last thing we need is pulling our hair out. What you need then is to get organized and get a political economic plan to try and move forward, and conditions will be bad. Let's not pretend they won't be bad. Marginally worse than they are now, for most people. Marginally worse. That has to be said. And this is why I argue time and time again that once the negotiations started, it was better to come back and report through popular assemblies in all the big cities and through television networks what was going on. The reports that were made in Parliament and to the press actually were misguided, if I'm going to be polite. It was a misreading of the situation. We have won. Won what? The Germans made it very clear. No victories had been achieved. This imbecile Juncker, who is taken seriously as a political figure when all he is a servant in the German chancery. Most Europeans didn't want him. The Germans insisted on having Juncker because it's better if some guy from a small, tiny, corrupt, financialized state does all the bad talk, and they can then hang on. But they can't do that anymore. Everyone knows the Germans are key. And the question being raised in Germany is, are they capable of exercising political leadership at this critical juncture in Europe? It's obvious that they themselves are discussing how to deal with the situation. They don't want the Germans to be seen as the new oppressors, etc., etc. These debates are going on. But on one thing, the IMF and the Troika, let's use the word because that's what they are, the Troika. The IMF and the Troika are agreed. No concessions that will weaken us politically in Europe or anywhere else in the world. And I will conclude by comparing briefly the situation in South America with the situation in Southern Europe. In South America, you had an interesting conjuncture. It was in this continent that neoliberalism was first tried, in Chile under Pinochet. That's where the Chicago boys went and created a system. And they said, oh, it works. Yes, it worked because you had an iron dictatorship pushing it through. Trade unions were banned. 200,000 trade unionist socialists had been killed. So yes, neoliberalism can work under these conditions. And then later, in a more modified way, they tried it on Argentina. And what did we see when the system crashed in Argentina? It didn't crash because of ultra-left mistakes. It was carried out by Carlos Menem, a Peronist, who accepted every single thing the US Treasury Department and the IMF told him. Everything they asked him, he did. The system collapsed. Collapsed. The banks were closed. People were on the streets. Workers' self-management in some factories, piqueteros in different parts of Argentina. 4 presidents fell within the space of, I don't know what it was now, 3 or 4 months. And then it had to be recovered. And in Venezuela, the impositions of the IMF created the crisis which produced the Bolivarian movement. Likewise, in Bolivia, it was the struggles against privatization, the struggles for trade unionization carried out by the movement for socialism, by the one led by our comrade here, and of course by Evo Morales and many, many others, which produced conditions where mass struggles combined with new political formations to create something new. And because Venezuela was a country rich in oil wealth, they could do it. One shouldn't ignore that fact. they could do it. And they did it, and they did inflict defeats on local capitalism and the corporations, but as they will be the first to tell you, Chavez used to say this openly and publicly as well as in private, we are not today in a global world situation where we can completely destroy capitalism or challenge it. This is not possible. We can regulate it, we can obstruct it, we can build things ourselves which are completely different, etc., etc., etc. He said all this. Evo Morales the same, Correa the same, but because their aims were very clear and they had won electoral victories, they did it. In Europe, the situation is more difficult. We have to accept that. It's not as easy. And even in South America, Hugo Chavez told me more than once, he said, when Fidel Castro and I talk, we are constantly seeing how the Americans are getting more and more bogged down in the Middle East. We wish there was a whole resistance in that region to keep their minds here so we have a few years free to build something in South America. And they did. The Americans were distracted, but they have not forgotten that continent. And they will come back, and therefore one mustn't think that everything that we have won is there in permanence. There is nothing permanent about it. It has to be fought for continuously. And if that is true of South America, it's even truer in Europe. I think it would be, my personal opinion is this. I think it would be a good thing if Greek withdrew or was expelled or whatever the mechanism is from the Eurozone. I think it's a misconception by Greek society linked to the fact that in the early years of the Eurozone, they felt that the whole country was more prosperous. People felt this individually and people felt this collectively. That is no longer the case. And so the argument has to be put, because unless you have some alternative, how can you convince people that this is possible? And by the way, it was the old Russian revolutionary, Lenin, a great believer in politics and the supremacy of politics, who said, when he was arguing with sectarians within his own party and outside, they said, oh, capitalism is collapsing. And he said, capitalism will never collapse unless there is an alternative. The Russian revolutionaries and the Chinese revolutionaries and the Vietnamese revolutionaries were lucky. They were lucky because they could make a revolution while fighting a war against foreign occupation. The collapse of the Tsarist state happened because the Tsarist state was virtually destroyed by its involvement in the First World War. The Japanese occupation of China created the situation where the Chinese extreme right could not fight the Japanese. The only forces that could fight them were the communists. The Vietnamese, as we know, fought against the French, the Japanese, the French against, and the Americans. That is how hegemony in these regions was established. In South America, it was different. The Cuban Revolution took the Americans by surprise. They were not prepared for it. But they got over the surprise very quickly. And they were completely determined to destroy every single movement that threatened to repeat what Fidel Castro and Che Guevara had done in Cuba. And they succeeded. You know, defeat after defeat. Some of the finest comrades in South America were wiped out. I have to say this, and I've said it a long time ago, they were wiped out because of adventurism. These were adventures. The notion that a small force based in Bolivia could take over Argentina, which was actually believed at the time through small focus was never serious. It ignored the fact that the dominant working class in Argentina, the large working class, was dominated by Peronism, which you couldn't defeat through armed struggle. You couldn't win that working class. So, but anyway, we lost many people, and then the Bolivarian turn began to see victories again. And the victory of Evo Morales in Bolivia, in particular, many of us saw as a vindication of the struggle of Che Guevara, but by new methods and new means. And many people saw it as that. And that is the world we live in, and we have to use every means possible to weaken capitalism. The question of totally defeating it on its own doesn't arise at the present time. It may, 20, 30, 40 years, who knows. But at the present moment, we have to push it back and carry through measures that actually are in the interests of ordinary people. That's how something lasting can be built, and that's why Greece and Spain are crucial. They are two crucially important countries in determining what happens to Europe over the next 10 years.